It's time to do some maintenance on my pickup. There it is, got it backed into the hanger. I spent a week and a half cleaning up the hanger, or straightening it up enough to get the pickup in there to do some work on it. And you can see this is kind of the reason why. It's been a rainy year this year. I don't know how much rain we've had, but anyway, it's pouring down rain. And it's not near as much fun working on these things out in the rain and the snow and the mud as it was 50 years ago when I first started doing this kind of stuff. It's a 2008 Dodge Ram 2500 6.7 liter quad cab 4-wheel drive. Now, my normal maintenance on this is to change the fluids in it, change the oil and the filters, change the oil filters, air filter, fuel filter, and grease it. Now normally there's 2 grease spots on the tie rod ends. There's a zert on the right and the left side on the tie rod ends that get greased. And then there is a zert inverted grease fitting on the drive shaft that goes from the transfer case to the front differential, and those are normally what get greased. But I made a few modifications to this last year. I put these hubs on it. They're Yukon hubs, so you can release the hubs on it, release the 4-wheel drive on it, releases the front axle. And those are a big improvement on the drivability of the car and 2-wheel drive. Improved my gas mileage up from about 18 miles a gallon locally to about 20-21 miles a gallon locally. I also put new U-joints, universal joints in the front axle, and both of those have zerts in them. Both of those are greasable. And then we had new ball joints put in the left hand side, and those are greasable. So this year we'll pull the front wheels off, and those axles, those front wheel bearings are now greasable. So just like the old days, we'll pull those off and clean those up and repack the bearings in the front axles, grease the ball joints and the front universal joints, in addition to the usual drive shaft and tie rod ends. And then we've got a little addition to the turbocharger. Quit working on it. I noticed that when the exhaust brake stopped working and we get codes on it. So we've got a new turbocharger to put in. That'll be a little additional maintenance. Other thing that we normally would be doing this time of the year would be changing the wheels, tires out from our summer highway tires to our winter tires. But this year we've got a little bit of work on the rear axles. A couple weeks ago I noticed that my right rear wheel seal was leaking. So I got new seals for both rear wheels, so those will be coming off to be replacing those, and we'll check the bearings on the rear wheels on those. You can see how shiny, wet looking the inside of that right rear wheel is, and you can see the grease actually on the brake caliper and coming down on the wheel, actually coming down onto the floor there right now. A couple weeks ago I noticed that the inside of that wheel was shiny when I walked by. Now that's not too unusual. In this country, we're driving it and it's wet. It gets wet on the inside of that wheel. And I thought it kind of looked a little shinier than usual, but I didn't pay too much attention to it. Then I noticed that there was a little bit of an odor around the place from gear oil odor. I didn't think too much of that because we just changed the gear oil in the lower units of the outboards on our skiff. Even though we were real careful to keep that in a container, and there's still some that get spilled on the ground, so I didn't pay too much attention to that. Then I was gone for a week moose hunting, and when I came back I noticed the odor was still pretty strong, and with the amount of rain that we've had here, that should have dissipated a long time ago. So looked underneath the truck, and again you could see the shiny on the back side of the tire, and see the grease coming down on that wheel. So I knew that wheel seal was bad. Well, I've ordered the new wheel seal and started cleaning up the shop here, the hangar here, getting ready to fix that. So I ordered 2 wheel seals. I got 115,000 miles on the truck. So anyway, we'll go ahead and replace those wheel seals and check those bearings out. Well, the first order of business here is to get this rear end jacked up, get the wheels off the ground so we can take the tires off. I just stuck a floor jack underneath the rear differential there and jacked it up so we got both sides at the same time. And then put the jack stands underneath the right and left side, so the whole rear end is suspended. I can work on both sides at the same time on here. Now because we're working on a wooden floor, those jack stands have a tendency to cut into the floor, the weight of it, and they could get unbalanced. Well, we've got a piece of sheet metal, piece of steel, thin plate. I think it's 3/16 plate, maybe 3/8 plate. 3/8 plate underneath each one of those jack stands to support the weight and spread it out across that wood. I got the tires and wheels off. This left side here doesn't look too bad. It's dirty, of course. I usually wash these off with a pressure washer before I bring them in here, but the weather's been so bad I didn't do that this year. But anyway, this side is dry. There's no sign of any oil leak, but I'm going to go ahead and pull this hub and everything off anyway and replace that seal. Okay, this right side is just as wet as it can be. Now, thankfully, I don't know how that would have turned out otherwise, but I'd put on those big differential covers here back not long after I got the truck, and so they carry a lot more fluid in them than a standard differential cover would. Well, anyway, they've had plenty of fluid in it. Obviously it's still getting plenty of lubrication in those bearings, so hopefully they're going to be okay. I'm going to go ahead and get a solvent gun and spray that down a little bit before I do any more work on it, just to get some of the grease and stuff off of it before I start pulling it. That wheel, that whole assembly there was literally dripping and caked in oil. So I took my siphon gun and sprayed it down with solvent. I put a tray underneath it to catch everything. So I still need to clean up that brake rotor and the calipers, the pads, once I get them off of there, because that oil's saturated and everything. Anyway, that's cleaned up enough now that I can start taking that apart. I think I'm going to find a container and drain that differential first to get that fluid out of that so it's not dripping out of the axle here. I need to drain that fluid out of there anyway and put new fluid in it. So we might as well do that next. A year or so after I bought the truck, I got these Mag high-tech differential covers for them. Normally I wouldn't have done that on a truck, but I use this quite a bit for heavy towing. I do have a equipment trailer and bobcat and excavator that I haul with it, and I've hauled a lot of rock around here with my dump trailer and stuff that I tow with this. I wanted some extra protection, some more oil and stuff in here, but we also wind up traveling quite a bit on the highway, and it's 1,000 miles highway trip from Prince Rupert down to Abbotsford, British Columbia, where we cross the border back into the States, and then we do a lot of driving when we go down there. And part of that driving, I've had a camper on here on the pickup, and we've towed heavy trailers down there where we've got 20-foot equipment trailers and loaded them up with stuff and then hauled them all the way back to Alaska, which can be kind of hard on everything. And so I got these differential covers. So they carry a little bit more oil in them, but they also have these fins on here which help dissipate the heat, help keep it a little bit cooler. At least that's the theory. They also have a nice drain plug in the bottom. It has a magnet in it, and I've taken that drain plug out. I'll show you that in a minute. It actually has some metal filings and stuff on it, and I need to inspect that and see what it is. It's kind of concerning that it has metal filings on it, but they appear to all be just metal filings, small filings and stuff, and nothing major. And we'll take a look at that and see what's on there, and then we'll wash this out and put some more oil in it and run it for a while and see what happens then. I'll also get a chance to inspect those axle ends and those bearings and stuff there where that seal is gone, is leaking, and we'll see if there's any damage there on the bearings or the axle ends. Now these MagTech differential covers, like I said, they have a nice big drain plug in the bottom of them. They also have a plug here. This is to check the height of the fluid when you fill it up. There's also on top is a filler cap that you can unscrew to fill from the top there, so you don't have to screw around with trying to get it in this face here and getting it to drain in there. That's always a pain in the butt to get fluid in there, although I do have a pump and everything for doing that. And then there's a dipstick on it, so you can take it out and check the fluid level regularly. Pretty much got it drained. That's a 2-gallon bucket, and it's about half full thereabouts, so there's over a gallon of fluid in there. Okay, here's the drain plug for that. You can see it's a nice big machined drain plug and a magnetic base on it, and there's some pretty good filings on there on that magnet. There's a lot of crap on there. Well, there's some sludge on there. Maybe the filings aren't too bad, or it's pretty fine. It's pretty fine sludge in there that's magnetic. Well, maybe it's not as bad as I was afraid it was. I'll inspect everything here and wash that differential out when I get done with the putting the bearings in there. Run it for a while and check it out and see how it goes. See if there's any more filings in there. Alright, these are the bolts on the brake calipers that hold them on to the axle, and they're a real pain in the butt to get out of there. I tried it with a regular 1/2-inch drive ratchet, and I couldn't budge them, and I tried it with this extension, or this breaker bar here, and that wouldn't touch them. I've got this real long breaker bar. It's a cheap Harbor Freight breaker bar, but it must be about 18 inches, 20 inches long, and that gives me a little bit more purchase on here. Now generally these are put in really tight, and they're put in with Loctite, but I've had those out of there before and changed those brake calipers and stuff, and so they've been broken loose, but I put them back in tight again. Again, I tried them with a 1/2-inch drive air impact wrench, and I couldn't get them to budge with it. So we'll see. Oh, so I can't get it to budge with that. I wind up putting about a 12-inch cheater pipe on that breaker bar. Still, there, I got it to move. Okay. Now you want those in there good and tight. You don't want those things coming out of there when you're driving down the highway, that's for sure. Well, I didn't put Loctite on them when I put them in. I just put them in hard with this breaker bar and a cheater on it. Okay, now that one's loosened up enough that I can get it out with this, with the impact wrench now. We'll get this top one. We'll get a little extension on there, even though that's a... Oh, okay. I got that one to move without putting a cheater on it. There we go. Air wrench now. Alright, I got that one. That's the top one. Put the bolt in here or it won't get lost. Okay. Now I've already got a piece of wire to hang this caliper up with. Get it wrapped around the brake, or the spring pack there. So I can take that caliper off there and hang it so the weight's not hanging from this hose. And we'll get that out of the way and pull the rotor off. And the rotor is a combination brake rotor and brake drum. It's got a drum in it for the parking brake. Well, anyway, now I can get out from underneath here and do the rest of it from outside. Actually, it's more comfortable laying down under here than bend over outside. Now, that big tray out from underneath there and put a small catch tray under there. It's just one that I cut out of a 1 gallon oil jug. Brake calipers can sometimes be a pain in the ass to get off. They just depend on the hydraulic pressure. You put hydraulic pressure on them when you push down on the pedal, which causes the piston to come out on this side, which causes them to come in, and then this pad on this side is just held in with against this piece here, and the whole caliper slides, which puts pressure on equally, supposedly, on both sides of them. And when you release it, there's no spring in there to pull the piston back or pull the pads back, so they almost constantly ride on the rotor a little bit. They never retract fully. They can be kind of a pain in the ass to get off, because as they wear, of course, you wind up with a little ridge right up here on the outer part of this caliper where the pad doesn't ride on it, and so the caliper, the pads are in and the piston is pushed in, and then you can't get the whole thing over that ridge that's worn in this caliper. Now, these are fairly new brakes. I've replaced the calipers and the discs about 1.5 years ago, I guess, and so they're not too old. And of course, this one's been sliding because it's had lots of oil on it, so I guess it'd get grit and dust in there, which would be like grinding compound, maybe cause it to wear more. But we need some kind of a deal to open those, push those pistons back in against the hydraulic pressure, push some of that hydraulic fluid back up in to the reservoir on the brake, the master cylinder. So I get a little screwdriver, this little pry bars work, and see how that dropped down as I push that in, and that way that gives me a little bit of clearance. Just push on that pad a little bit. We'll see what happens if I can slide that off of there now. No, not yet. A little bit more. There we go. There we go. Okay. Now I'm going to slide this wire back on this spring bundle to get that. Oh, that inner pad's worn pretty good on that. Huh. There's little keepers on these lug bolts here. They're just kind of like a spring washer, with little teeth on them, and that holds this drum to keep it from coming off when the tire and wheel come off, to keep it on the axle. So we got to get those off there. Now they have a tendency to get boogered up when you take them off the first time, so they wind up not being put back on there. I put these back on, and you can kind of thread them off a little bit. So there's only one. There might be only one on this one. No, there's one, of course, all the way down there on the underside. Yeah, there's what those look like. Just like a washer with fingers sticking out on it. Now this rotor drum combination could come off, and if the brake shoes on the inside of this were worn and pushed out, you wouldn't be able to get that off without getting behind there and adjusting those shoes out, but those are okay. I'll need to scrub all that stuff down thoroughly with solvent to make sure and get all of the grease and oil out of the pores and everything onto that. I don't have to take the brake shoes off to get this wheel, this hub off of here, but I'm going to, I think I will anyway. I'll take those brake shoes off so I can see better. Then we got a backing plate here for the brake shoes, and the brake shoes on here are pretty much the same as a standard set of drum brakes. They're just smaller, or like they would be on a small car. They've got a spring in here that holds them in this way, adjuster down on the bottom, and then little keepers in here, little pins in here that with keepers on them that hold the shoes in tight against the backing plate. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off of there just to make it easier to see back there. The seal is back in behind here. Of course, this hub comes off. The seal should be in the hub. or will be in the hub hopefully, but I want to be able to see the seal seat, the part that seal rides against, and make sure that it's not grooved out or butchered up. They got that parking brake, drum brake portion out of the way, make it a little easier to see in here. Moving this, a little bit of backlash on that, but there's no lateral movement, no movement up and down, no movement in and out. Pretty good indication that the bearings are okay in here. The next thing to do is to take these bolts out here. These are the axle bolts, and once we get these bolts out, then that axle will just pull out, and then that'll give us access to the thrust nut and washer and in there. And then this hub, once we get those bolts out and nuts out off of there, see this shaft that this axle housing that comes out in here comes out, and it's tapered down and it's machined on there, and it's got threads on this end, and that axle nut fits on there, and that's what holds those bearings and stuff in. Tapered bearings, it pushes in on it to hold this hub on there. So we'll take these bolts off of here, pull that axle out, and then we'll have access into the nut that holds the hub on. I got those bolts out of there on the axle, hold the axle in, and those things came out of there hard all the way. They had quite a bit of sealant on the threads, and I was glad I had the air wrench to get those out of there with. Oh, I tapped this axle flange a little bit, and it got popped right loose. Oh, bring it right out. Now, inspecting the gears on that, they actually look pretty good. I don't see any problems with those. I'll look at them a little closer, but I don't see any problem with those. There's a gasket here on the axle flange, and I didn't make a new one, or I didn't get a new one. I'll just be careful taking it off there so I don't tear it. Like I said, if I do tear it, I just make a new one. A little bit of stick 'em on it right there. It's going to tear. It's got a little bit of glue on it in a couple spots there to hold it on that axle. I got the axle out, and I got the axle flange gasket off there. It's got a little tear in it. A person could reuse that with, put some Gookumpucky, some RTV or something on there, and seal that back up. But I've got gasket material. I think I'll make a new gasket to put on there. Now you can see the differential fluid, the gear grease coming out of that axle housing now, and that's what was leaking through that seal on that hub. That's what lubricates those bearings. That fluid grease comes in, is partially up in these axle housing here, and it actually comes through and goes down into this hub to help lubricate those bearings there. And so that's why there's seal on the back of that. It's good. Instead of having grease packed in grease, it's just a floating rear end, and those bearings float in the oil. There's a keyway in this differential housing where it's machined out there, the threads, and anyway, there's a keyway machined in that. Threads around the outside here, keyway there, and there's a little keeper right there that goes around. It's captured in that thread, about the second thread in, and the end of it is bent down, and it goes down into that keyway. Just stick in there in that keyway, get underneath that spring, and just pop it right out of there. That just comes right out. Set that aside where we don't lose it. And then there's a key in the keyway, and you got a nut here, and the nut has different slots in it, keyways in it, put in, so when you tighten that in, that's what preloads the bearings. The bearings are inside of here behind this. I don't know whether it's a washer behind there or what, but anyway, there's a that's a nut, and it's got keyways cut in the nut, so you can have different positions on there for preloading that bearing. You tighten that nut down to preload the bearing, and that's how she works. So we got to get something to take that nut out of there, loosen that nut up with. Now, most of the nuts I've ever dealt with have been just hex nuts, just like a regular nut, large hex nuts, and I do have a socket for large hex nuts in some of my trucks that work on those, but the way we've always done it, or did it for 1,000 years, most guys out in the field that weren't in a shop that didn't have the right tool, would just take a cold chisel. And almost all of the older vehicles that you open up, when you check the axle bearings on them, where it's the front hub or the rear hub or whatever, they'll have a notch in it here, and maybe 2 or 3 of them around, where somebody's taken a cold chisel and used that to unscrew that nut. I don't have a socket for that, the right size socket for that. I was thinking about building one, but I think I'm just going to go ahead and get a punch, a round punch, and we'll see what we can do here. Alright, so I had a couple different ideas of how I was going to do this, and one thought that I had was I could take a piece of pipe, maybe, and grind out some pins or weld some pins on it or something like that, and make a spanner type socket for that. Of course, the obvious one is just to take a punch and just take the hammer and punch down on it. The other idea that I had was to take 2 punches like this, put them in opposing holes. Now those aren't really holes, they're more slots, they're circular slots. But if I take those, put those in there like that, and hey, that worked out pretty good. That worked out real good. Just use that as a spanner. Now once I get it loosened up, I can just take it out with my fingers. Let me get a clean towel to lay down here to put all these pieces on. There's no point, even though we're going to clean them up, there's no point putting any more contamination in them than I have to. Okay. There's the nut. And that's just the bearing behind it, so this thing will slide, supposedly slide right off of there. I'll put a little pair of needle nose right in that groove, and there's the outer bearing. And just a cursory quick glance on that, I don't see anything wrong with it. It's got lots of oil in it. I don't see any chips in the chrome, no grease. It's not loose in the race. Well, that looks good. That's good. So the outer bearing is good. Now the seals. It's stuck on the seal in there, of course. I'll get a the seal's coming apart. There it come. Okay. And we'll put that down right there and inspect that seal. Yeah, the seal just came right apart. The metal part of the seal is still there. So the outer shell of the seal is still there on the race for it. So I'll have to get a puller or something and pull that off of there. Huh. Well, that's pretty well foobarred there. You don't have to worry about screwing it up. Anyway. There's no galling or anything on the bearing races here so far, so those bearings weren't spinning on the axle, so that all looks good. And that's tight on there. That wasn't spinning on that. That's one of the things I was afraid of there, is that maybe that seal had spun on that race for it. We got to get this off. This is the outer seal half here. And, you can see the seal pretty much disintegrated there. I wonder it was leaking. Yeah, gunk in there. Now here's what a new seal looks like. You can see this is the inner portion of the seal here. This is the part that I just took out in there. I think I'm going to take this backing plate off. I want to keep this truck for a long time. And this stuff's starting to get rusty on there. There's crud on the back of it. So I think I'm going to take this backing plate off, or this brake hanger back off, so I can sandblast it and paint it, clean it up, and I can get in there on that axle housing and clean that up too. I don't remember where I was at now on this. I think I was trying to get that seal off of there. It was pretty much seized on or froze onto this part that's turned on it on the axle for it. And then because there's a whole bunch of rust and crap buildup back in here behind this brake hanger plate, I wanted to take all that off, and so I can get it cleaned up. I'll get a needle scaler or something and clean that all up, and then wire brush it all down and paint it so it'll last another 10 years anyway, hopefully. But I got that off, and that was a pain in the butt. There's bolts that are pressed in. They're pretty much like lug bolts. They're pressed in and they go through this part of the axle here, and then there's a nut on the back side of them, and that nut takes a 15/16 wrench socket. The bottom two aren't too bad, you can get on those, but it was all I could do to get those broke loose with my long breaker bar. I didn't have too much try, I didn't have to put a cheater on it. I was able to get them broke loose with it. But these upper ones, the time you get the socket on there, and then you can't get in it because of these U-bolts here for the spring hangers, for the axle hangers. You can't get lined up on that U-bolt. So I was finally able to get a regular breaker bar in there and get them broke loose. And then they run out of room when you're taking the nut off of there to get it off. So I got the bottom ones off and the top two loosened up, and then I took a hammer and knocked that out so I had room on it so I could get the sockets off the nuts. So I got that brake hanger plate off. Now I got to figure out how to get that emergency brake cable, parking brake cable, loose from there. It's got a bend section here that goes through an eye in the actuator where it goes through this plate and actually actuates the brakes. And there's a spring in here, and it goes through this clamp right here. Well, I'll pull that spring back, and there's a plastic or metal collar in there with a couple of tabs that fold out to keep that thing from going through there. So I want to get that off of there. The back side of that plate doesn't look quite so bad, but the lower section of it down here has got a lot of crud on it, rust on it. If I clean it up now and paint it up, then I don't have to replace it in 2 or 3 years, 5 years, whenever it is I have to do this again. Finally got that pad off there, that plate off of there. It was kind of a pain. The biggest problem was getting this emergency brake, parking brake cable off of there. You can see it's got this double hook here that fits in to the eye on this actuator right here, and so you kind of have to get that thing set like it is with the parking brake fully set, and then getting this loose from this. This is the casting that goes on there. It actually goes like this, and this part here is the eye that this parking brake cable goes through. So that was kind of a pain. It's got a collar on it inside this spring. Well, there's the collar right here, and then there's a another little collar on there that's got tabs on it that stick out. So this collar, you can see the parking brake cable is smaller there. That goes through that eye and then pulls through, and then this collar fits in there, and those locking tabs stick out and keep that locked in there. Fighting against those springs and everything, that was kind of a pain in the butt. But I got that apart, and it's good because this is really nasty back here on this portion that's exposed. It's got flaky rust on it, exfoliated rust that's coming out on it, and dirt and stuff like that mixed in there. So we'll get I've got a little needle scaler. We'll clean that all up and then wire brush it and get it all cleaned up and get it painted, and then I'll polish up this section here. Now that seal is a two-piece seal. One piece spins inside the other one, so it'll lock on this. The seal lip doesn't ride on this polished portion here like it does on a lot of axles. It presses over that, and then the seal spins inside of it. So it's an oil-proof seal, not just a dust-proof seal. So that doesn't have to be polished up too much on that axle shaft there, or on that spindle shaft there. But it still needs to be cleaned up and get the rust off of that and everything.